morning. My name is Steph Eisenbise, and I'm with Living Well Institute, and you're joining us this morning with John Reitz, a friend and colleague of ours at Living Well Institute. I'll let him give an introduction of his own background and experience, but would just set up the stage for what we're going to talk about this morning, which is how to renew your physical health. And when we say physical health, that's connected to the physical health of your own body that you live in, but also the health of your physical environment and how to maximize your resources. And the community dialogues on health and wholeness we've been hosting here at Living Well Institute for probably the past 8 to 9 weeks. And they've been a great interactive format to bring experts from the East Coast, even out to the West Coast of the US, and to just share in a dialogue where we exchange ideas, experience, and inspire our community. And when we say community, now we're grateful through this experience, which has brought both pain and growth as a global community, that extends far and wide now. So inviting folks in our community into an experience to really consider how could you step out of this experience and into the next season, whatever that looks like for you, with a greater level of health and connection. So with that, I would turn it over to John. And John, if you could give folks a brief background on your experience and what brings you here today, and then we can jump into the conversation.
Sure. I have been part of Living Well pretty much since the beginning in terms of helping to form some of the thinking, especially in the area of mind and spirit. I have been a pastor for 35 years. I've also served as a hospital chaplain in the Middle East for 3 years. I have been a marriage and family therapist for about 30 years now, and have enjoyed working in all kinds of different contexts. So that's sort of what I bring to the table. Probably most important is I'm another human being going through this with everybody else. So that's what I think most sort of connects me to be able to speak about the kind of things that are affecting us today.
Thank you, John. And I think the wealth of background and experience that John brings is really important. And I love that he brings it back to that human to human connection. And we talk about that a lot at Living Well Institute. We are a community health nonprofit, and we call ourselves a family business and a business of families. And that restoration, even as you look at the bottom of the screen here and see the I love, that's really our posture, is to create a space that's full of unconditional love and without judgment, and to help people walk through a process of transformation where they can discover the keys to their own health and well-being. And when we say health and well-being, that's a holistic perspective. And John alluded to this, that includes body, mind, and spirit. And so we've incorporated the foundational principles of the lifestyle program that we offer here at Living Well into these dialogues, not because we want to promote our program, but because we've really found that of the thousands of people that have walked through both our doors and the doors of the community providers that we work with, they're foundational concepts for health and well-being that start with taking responsibility for your health, renewing your mind, your spirit, and your body, and really understanding those 3 components for you individually. And they're as unique as your own fingerprint. And then learning how to maximize your resources, integrate those, and do it daily. And it's been a process that we've found for ourselves individually. We believe as an organization, you can't give away something you don't own. So it really is both a perspective and a context that we try and live from as we serve other people. And it's been beneficial for the folks that we interact with in the community. And when I called John, I asked him, I said, would you be interested in jumping into this dialogue? And we've had a diverse panel of experts that have been part of these conversations. And John was part of one of the early ones that we hosted here back in either March or April. And I invited him back in to just do a dialogue between the 2 of us, to have him just share some of his experience and expertise. It's been amazing to hear some of the stories that he shared, both for the work that he's doing locally here in the Northeast, as well as across the globe. And it really knits our community together, and I think provides a perspective for people when they think about their own physical health of their own body, as well as their home environment, and what resources have been foundational. So John, with that, if you could share some of the experience you've had over the last couple months with the folks that you're serving, whether it's through counseling, coaching, consulting, here locally and across the world, I think our community would love to hear it.
Sure. Well, first let me say a lot of my work is done locally, but I also do some things in terms of across the U.S. but I also am a support person and a supervisor for people in different parts of the world. So during this crisis, I have interacted with people in Spain, which has been very hard hit, also in Jordan, which is sort of another way of handling the coronavirus, and also in Bhutan. And when I look at all of those, it's interesting how a person goes through something like this, depending upon what part of the world they're living in. We happen to be sort of going through this in a part of the world that focuses more on who the individual is than what the community is. I say that, and I pull back from that a little bit, because when it comes to ourselves in terms of going through this, and we've had to be in the same living space as other people, if we're in a family, if we have other people in our home or apartment or wherever we live, it's interesting because in that world, we have actually lost a lot of the individual, because where we would normally get that by going out, going to work, going other places, has now been sort of closed in, and now we're operating as a group of who's ever in that family. What's interesting in that is it's creating a lot of stress in regards to being able to have my own personal time. And we are getting a lot of togetherness time, but finding ways. So I've even encouraged people to see their car sitting outside or in a garage as another room of the house, where you might be able to get some more individual space to be able to get away from the community long enough so I can come back well enough to be able to live how we're not used to living. It's also one of the reasons I believe that things like domestic violence, child abuse goes up during a time like this, because the too much togetherness puts a stress on a system. And so it's been intriguing to watch in terms of what's been happening in our own local area with this idea of community and the individual need in order to be in a healthy community. So that's one of the things that I've seen that really has been stressful to a lot of people as I've talked to them.
Well, John, I really appreciate that picture that you painted, and I think you're right. For the orientation of much of the United States, we're, you think about the Declaration of Independence, we're a fairly independent-minded nation. And so now that we're in homes and in apartments and in settings that really are to some degree isolated from the community at large, for sure, but then creation of a community that may not have existed, at least not at the level of intensity that it does now, it's creating more stress on top of the stress that's just in the environment right now, knowing that there's a virus out there that could kill you, that it's causing a lot of financial stress, all of the other stressors that are sort of externally out there. Then there are stressors in here in the home environments. And it occurred to me yesterday, we lead a program for addiction recovery, and one of the people who has been in and out of recovery shared that, addicts don't like change. They like things to stay the same. And if you were to extrapolate that out to the human population in general, we're not really hardwired to embrace change and go running into it. And when you consider where you were individually when this radical change hit, how equipped were you to manage your own stress and the stress in your own home? One of the things that we believe in real strongly at Living Well is being authentic and transparent about our own experience. And I shared last evening on that program, and I would share here, that when I took the opportunity yesterday, I went for a walk in the woods at lunch. I took a break and recognized, okay, we're at step 4 in our process. I need to renew my body, physical health. I'm doing a lot of sitting in front of the computer. And when I was in the woods, I thought back to 2.5 months ago, and I had to ask myself, how equipped was I what level of resilience and just regular maintenance on my own car, if you will, had I been doing to manage this stress. Um, and I would be honest in saying I was not doing a great job at managing the level of stress I had. And so certainly this experience gave me an opportunity where I knew that for my immune system, for sustaining the level of work that I'm committed to and the relationships that I have, I needed to get a handle on that. But I think this situation, John, when you talk about domestic violence, child abuse, all of all of those negatives that we're seeing that are expressions of a tremendous amount of stress in a family's home and predisposed trauma and other experiences that were inherent in that home environment prior to COVID-19, they're all starting to express themselves. So I'd be curious to hear, what are you seeing in the people that you're interacting with that have been beneficial tools to address some of that in healthy ways? Aside from the tool that I love that you recommended, I'm thinking about the car that's out in my backyard right now to think about the car being another home environment or another living space that you can find some space when you need to take a break, step back, as we say at Living Well, catch your breath, reset your button. What other tools are you finding to be helpful?
Well, I think one of the major sort of helpful tools, which doesn't seem to be a tool at all, is the realization of how big a deal this is. And I say that because I've also done some work with people in the medical field. And they're used to being, let's say, in an environment where a lot is expected in terms of handling crisis. And so it can be seen almost like this is just a bigger crisis, rather than seeing it as a pandemic that is the most major thing we've hit in our lifetime. What that does is make you rethink, and I like your thinking of anytime you can pull in creativity, it's helpful. Let me give you an illustration of why it's hard here to really activate that. In my travels of India, it really struck me when I was there. I was driving in a car and something happened with the wheel. And we were out in a village somewhere, pulled into not even a gas station, but a small shed. And what the guy did was what we would call jerry rigged it so that we could sort of move on. So he had to create what he had in his shop and around to be able to make our vehicle be able to get to the next place. In the United States, we do it differently. We take our car to a garage, and the mechanic will either go to a shelf, get the part needed, or call another place and they will drive while he's working on the car, the part that's needed. The difference is here we just go to the shelf and get the part. There you have to create something. And that's part of what's interesting right now, the advantages of being in a underdeveloped or developing country. A person has been trained more to use what they have in terms of ingenuity, where we have been so used to just going and getting something and replacing something. You begin thinking, if you think and draw that out, creativity is our best friend. And so most people I talk about wouldn't even think about using their car for another room, because that's not a room. Well, when you have a household of kids, that's a really good room. And you're able to go somewhere and have some peace and quiet. And so you begin seeing that to use our creativity, and what I'm trying to do is encourage people to go somewhere that they already have, but it's really been put on hold. And during a time like this, you need to bring that out. I talk to people in another part of the world where they are constantly constantly in a war-torn area. And so what we're experiencing actually in great comfort. But if you think with me about being in a pandemic called a war, not for a few months, but for years, you really get a different feel of life. And I'm not saying that to make it sound like we should sort of see ourselves in a war right now, because it is a health issue that we really need to face, but more to say, how do we handle difficulties? The other piece that I really encourage people is crisis doesn't as much put stress on us as it reveals how we deal with stress. So the pandemic is a great revealer. And so I'm encouraging people in terms of to take this time to also look, what kinds of things does it raise sort of in my life? Let me give you an illustration. There's a little story that I like to use with people. And I think it's a helpful kind of story because especially during this time, it sort of strikes us. It's a story that was written by Peter Kreeft, who was a professor at Boston University. But he talks about the difference between bird seed and monkey seed. Let me just read it, and I think it'll allow people to sort of see this is a time that's sort of discerning in us as much as how do we function. This is what it says. There lives in us, deep down in the heart, a little nightingale that keeps calling for its birdseed. It's a bothersome but infinitely precious little bird. The nightingale lives way down under a host of larger, louder animals, each demanding its own food. So it's easy to ignore. It has a small, still voice, but when we ignore it, even if we feed all the other animals, which is impossible, we are not satisfied because we are that nightingale and we are starving. So we try to quiet this still small voice. We feed the nightingale dog food and cat food and monkey food, mostly monkey food. But it keeps crying for nightingale food, and we can't find nightingale food. Yet, though we do not feed it, it does not die. We can muffle it, but we cannot kill it. Eventually, we must face our inner truth, our nightingale, and ask, what do you want? What do you want? During this season, our own body is speaking to us. And part of that is we can get enough food in our house. We can get other things that sort of begin to, in some way, dull the things we feel and almost pamper ourselves. But the nightingale is still crying out. This is an excellent time to go inside of ourselves to see what are we hungry for. And usually, first we have to pull off all the kinds of things that have sort of covered up what we're really hungry for. This kind of time is a wonderful time to listen for the nightingale. What's it crying out for? What's it want? And so it may mean, all the things we have, that doesn't satisfy what the cry is. Maybe, as you said, a walk in nature begins connecting us a little bit more with the kind of food that feeds body, mind, and spirit, rather than thinking of something just as normal as the next meal. To begin asking, what's the next meal for me holistically? That we're not used to doing, and that's one of the advantages of a time when you have to step out of the busyness of life and you have to sit in your own house, which scares a lot of people to death because that bird starts chirping. And you can't just drown it out with TV, with other kinds of things. It keeps chirping. And if we answer that, we come out the other side of a pandemic in a whole different way than we entered it. And to me, it's not just a matter of, can I get through this time? How will I come out of this time? What's next for me? Because that's the hopeful side. So that's a little bit of sort of what churns in me as I work with people, that I want to help them get through. But I think it would be like just treating somebody in their symptoms and never really getting to the cause. And we're good at that in our culture. Mm-hmm. As long as I can cover up sort of the symptom and dull it, I'll get through this time. All of those symptoms are voices. There's something that's wrong here. And pandemics, they only come around once in a while. And they are sort of something that can begin cleansing me. But we're worried about what might come into my body. We need to start thinking about how this whole pandemic can cleanse my body rather than what's going to come into it. That's important as well, but I think there's more to be gathered out of what I need cleansed out of me so I can maybe live for the first time.
I think that's a great perspective, John. And I was hoping, as you were saying you were going to share a story, that you would share that one. It's one that you've shared before in some of our trainings, and I really appreciate it. And I think it's interesting, even considering for folks in the Northern Hemisphere, from a seasonal perspective, it's spring. And now, even in larger cities, people are reporting that they're able to hear bird songs in the morning when they wake up. And, you consider the idea that sometimes it's darkest just before dawn. For many people, this is a really, really dark time. And I think I would say for myself personally, there are mornings where I wake up and think, okay, it's going to be the start of a new day. And just hearing that bird song is an orientation to me to what John was talking about. And it is a tremendous opportunity. And when we think about, John's right, this pandemic that we're all experiencing, it is a really big deal. And it likely, my hope would be it won't happen again in our lifetimes. But it's a tremendous opportunity for people to change. And I heard somebody that I'm friends with on the West Coast say last week, they said, the people that are learning in this time and learning during times of radical change are going to come out much further ahead in terms of what John just talked about, your own wellspring of life energy and vitality in your own life. And I think for many people, I would completely agree with how John phrased it. It's really scary to just sit inside of your own home. And whether that's your own physical home, because that's not something that's been a normal orientation for you, to be home with your kids and have to homeschool them, to be home with potentially a partner who's domestically violent. I mean, there's all kinds of things that make people have fear about being in their home. But we also talk about home being here, the home that we live in physically. It's really scary for all of us, if we're real honest, to spend a lot of time just looking inward and being real honest, like John said, of peeling back those layers and asking ourselves, what's really going on inside of there? And I think their creativity, as John put it, is a tremendous, tremendous way to step out of some of this, or to step into some of it in a way that feels life-giving and that allows for a discovery process, rather than feeling like this is a burden and you're doing some deep soul searching and you have to have it all figured out at the end. I think that invitation into a creative process could be something as simple as stepping outside. I was amazed yesterday at how many people were on the trail, and it was a lot of families with kids. And I think there's that level of people feeling like they're going stir crazy being inside of their home. And I would say probably on a daily basis, I go through a gratitude list. And one of the ones that continues to be on my list is that we're experiencing this in May and not in December. Again, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, we're stepping into summertime, and the ability to be outdoors and to have fresh air. I mean, the coronavirus is something that impacts your lungs, and our ability from a health perspective to get fresh air, to boost our immunity, to take care of our physical health. And even like John said, we're a culture that relies extensively on external resources for our physical health, for sure, but for our mental and social spiritual health too. We are a consuming culture that extracts things and puts them into ourselves, rather than typically the orientation being looking internally for resources first.
Let me say this as well, because another part of sort of what I do in my life work is help people who are in and going into new cultures. And really what we're experiencing today is as much a sort of cross-cultural experience within our own life. So it's creating in us a need to go to a new place that we have not been before. And it's very much like if anybody was going to take a job, let's take someplace in the Middle East, it's a real cultural shock to go to a new culture. One of the tools that's most important in going to a new culture is to enhance our ability to have gratitude and really sort of keep a list of what kinds of things, what I'm thankful for, because everything is changing in a new culture. And so most people, when they go into a new culture, talk about how terrible that culture is because it's not like the culture I came from, rather than having a deep appreciation of what do I have. A simple thing for me every day when I pray, I thank God for another day of life. Now, I have the advantage of having lost my dad, my mom, and a wife. And so when I pray, thank you for another day of life, I mean it. To be able to be alive, even to be in the pandemic, is a gift to have life. These are the things often we're so busy sort of grabbing for the next thing that we don't stop and appreciate all the things we have. And if you do that, it's almost like you bring sort of a special gift along when you go into a new culture, because these are the familiar things. These are the things that you've already received. And so there's a sense of, if I've received these, there's more to receive. So it brings a sense of hope. But if you only look at what's missing, and that's why I call this a cross-cultural experience, because right now we're seeing what we're missing. And if you watch and you listen and you read, most of the dialogue is about what we're missing in life, not being thankful for what we have in life. If a person makes that change, it will affect them for the rest of their life. If
Well,
they hold up, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, that change really, it's a change in your orientation and your perspective. It's an internally driven change that doesn't necessarily directly correlate to an expected change or what you're seeing externally.
Right. And if you think of it this way, we're talking about the atmosphere that our body lives in. And so what it really means is, during this time, getting the virus out of me so that I can experience life and experience it in a way maybe like I've never experienced it before. And those are really some of the pieces, if you think of it, we are so used to. That's why, our society has such a hard time with drugs, alcohol, other addictive behaviors. It is because it's more sort of, I need to numb what is hurt, rather than I need to find what is hurt and move into a new way of living so I can have life and to be able to experience it in ways, because the atmosphere around me, I have chosen. Most people, the atmosphere around them, the circumstances have sort of closed in on them. That's why last summer, I visited Auschwitz and Birkenau. I did that purposely because I do appreciate history, but I also wanted to sort of get closer up and in touch with how people make it through very difficult times. And the people who made it through very difficult times, there's a sense of, even though all hell was breaking loose, they had some sense of the atmosphere around them they chose. So no matter what somebody else did to them, they chose how they would live.
Mm-hmm.
And so choosing life and choosing how we live, you can go through a lot of hell and still be able to have hope, to have a sense of joy, even in the midst of all of that. But if you don't control the atmosphere around you and in you, really you're at the whim of whatever happens. And these are the kind of times that really show that, in terms of what's the atmosphere and what's inside of me. And again, I can use that in this time about talking about viruses that are inside, not just viruses that could attack my body.
Mm-hmm.
What ones have been attacking my body since I've been a little kid, but I just never got rid of them.
Mm-hmm. And to consider what the healthy ways to address those are. I mean, to some degree, our immune system is strengthened by some level of exposure to viruses and bacteria. And I say that not suggesting that somebody should go out and expose themselves intentionally to a virus or bacteria, but that is part of what builds up that resiliency. But like John said, we have choice. And I think we have tremendous power that comes from inside of ourselves that many of us aren't necessarily taught that we have. And that power to control and influence the environment that you're creating internally for yourself as well as externally. I love the comparison you draw about stepping into a new culture. You know, I had a conversation with somebody who works at an agency at our state capitol, and she said, you know, I've been working from home, and now that we're transitioning and opening back up to some degree, she said, when I went into the office, it's like a ghost town, even walking along the riverfront. And so she's orienting herself from this perspective of the old and where we were before, and what her mind and that self-generated idea of what reality would look like should be. And I think what John's inviting us into is this creative perspective to say, how do we step into a new culture with a spirit of curiosity, with an open heart? You know, we think about some of these situations, and if you ask yourselves individually, what's my response to change? What's my response to pain? I think about your experience going to Auschwitz, and I think that's a tremendously painful historical experience to step into. And yet I would say the people who've experienced the greatest amount of pain and found a way to ground themselves in an atmosphere that continues to give life, even amidst tremendous pain, are huge, huge examples for all of us to really step into a context that would continue to be life-giving.
Well, you know, people will say, I'm not a creative person. I'd like to suggest that creativity is as much a part of us as our arms and legs. It's there.
Mm-hmm.
We usually give it up once we become adults and the big people.
Mm-hmm.
Let me give you a simple illustration of my own life in terms of going through this time. I got this crazy idea at one point. I travel a lot, so I have sound canceling headphones. I've never used them anywhere else but on the plane. And on one day, it just struck me, go up and get your headphones and go outside and listen to some music that you most enjoy. And it was the most relaxing sort of time. You might say that's not a big dose of creativity. You don't need a big dose.
Mm-hmm.
But the creativity came in. I was used to using those headphones one way. And when I started using them another way, it really made that day so much better. And so you might say, well, you know, I use my headphones all the time. So another person's creativity might be something else. But it's just a matter of seeing things and using things differently. And so when I go back to India, the way they jerry-rigged that vehicle, I would have never imagined you could do that.
Mm.
But they're used to needing to use their creativity because they don't have all the resources. Where do we live? We are resource rich. We don't have to use creativity. But then a time like this comes, or a person going through a very difficult time in terms of their health, or a time of life when they lose somebody, and that's a time where you need your creativity to get you through that time. And so those are really important times to use, even it's a small bit of creativity, but it's in us. We just haven't had to use it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's for the little people. That's not for the big people. And what I'm finding is, even in the aging process, as you age, you can get more creative because you have to figure out how to do things that you have to do in new ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really getting in touch with that because it's part of who we are. It comes packaged in us.
Mm-hmm.
And so the beauty of that is just unwrapping that. And again, what a wonderful season to unwrap in terms of what we have in us, not just what can we bring into our world.
Absolutely. Well, and I think, like John said, I would encourage all of you to consider that invitation into creativity. And if I could provide any advice on that experience, is just to be open to an unexpected outcome. I think the older we get, the more we have a preconceived idea and a predicted outcome for what something like that would look like. And when I hear you talk about the headphones early on in the pandemic here, I had gone to the grocery store and I realized just the level of stress and fear that was in that environment was baffling to me. And I've sort of trained myself to be aware of internally where I am and my level of connection to mind, body, spirit, and energetically where I am, as well as the external environment. And I know that if I'm feeling connected and balanced, I can have some degree of external influence in a positive way on that environment. And yet I went in there, and the second time I thought, you know what, I'm going to do similar to what John suggested. I thought, I'm going to change my internal environment to have a different impact when I'm in an external environment that's stressful. So I put headphones in and I put music on that inspired me. And that allowed me to decrease my level of stress of being in an environment that both had stress externally and was kicking up stress in me internally. And the next time I went to the grocery store, I realized to some degree I had my own orientation and had gone through sort of a self-inventory on my own and done some research on what my own individual perspective was relative to the level of risk being at the grocery store, having a mask on, social distancing. And I made a choice to posture myself differently in that environment. And it was amazing to see the impact and the ripple effect that had on the other people in the grocery store. Because I think, we talked about this early on in the program, we're having a human to human experience. And oftentimes I think we're so internally focused of what's going on in our own lives and our own suffering that we're unaware of the impact we have on the people around us. And it was amazing. There were a couple interactions that I remember quite vividly with people in the grocery store that made an effort to just have a human to human connection and to say, hey, I think one guy passed me and he said, I know I'm in a mask and I'm not going to rob you. Don't be afraid. And trying to have some level of humor in this and a human to human connection, saying, wow, we're all experiencing this. I think, like John, I'm used to traveling a lot. So early on, I sort of correlated it to that experience of now when you travel on airplanes, it's really stressful. People are trying to get through security as quickly as they can. They get on the plane and they're trying to jam their luggage in as quickly. And so it's this real stressful experience. And it's almost, I scratched my head when I went to the grocery store, it almost felt similar to that. And yet I realize it's in those times where I watch sort of the outliers and their response for people who can change that atmosphere. And you can sense it and pick up on it. If you have sort of a discovery process in the next week and consider when you're at the grocery store, even when you're in your own home, to be aware of the energy that's in that space. And oftentimes people look at us kind of crosswise at Living Well and they say, what do you mean about the energy? And I would describe that similar to how John said, it's that atmosphere. And when you walk into your home, or you walk into your office, or you walk into your school, and you can realize right away if something's off, if the person you're connected to is in a bad space, if somebody's in pain, if somebody's in a good mood. And having an awareness of what's going on internally and externally from that energetic or atmospheric perspective, I would say is also a tremendous gift of creativity and intuition in this time.
And I think with that comes the idea, I would say we're more individualistic than more individual. And because of that, to use your illustration, going into an environment in terms of it's so easy to catch what is there of an atmosphere rather than be an individual and I take my individual atmosphere in.
Mm-hmm.
And right now what's happening is, and you can watch it in our country, people's whole emotional system is influenced by what they're hearing, how other people's emotional system is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I say we're individualistic, but we really haven't developed enough of our own identity to be able to know the world can take a different position than I take, and it's okay. It really is okay. It's when I have to either get other people on my side or somehow I'm deeply affected because of what somebody else thinks or feels. It puts me more in a glob of environment rather than an individual who's there. And this is one of the things that's really showing in our country is that identity isn't a strong thing that we hold as people, as human beings. It's more we gather a lot of identity off of other people.
Mm-hmm.
And to be able to stand alone and to be able to hold my own, even if all of the world takes a different perspective, I can still be who I am. And that's part of, again, what happens during a time like this, you recognize, because you see, the more you take in of other people's atmosphere, the higher your anxiety, the higher your depression, because you're taking somebody else's stuff as well. I tell people, especially in a family environment, if everybody took their own sort of amount of anxiety, the family would be okay.
Mm-hmm.
But usually what happens is we take other people's as well. And now we can handle so much anxiety as a human being, but we can't handle it for two people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that taking on other people's stuff that really becomes a problem during this time, because it means I'm not sort of seeing my own personal identity is what creates what I need to be in community. And so if I don't have that, I'm really fighting community.
I think that's foundational. And John, you touched on something. Our self-identity and our confidence in who we are is huge. And it's painful to watch in our country the back and forth and the divisiveness, and to be completely honest, even outside of a dualistic perspective of whether you're right or wrong, left or right, wearing a mask or you don't want to wear a mask. If you take a couple giant steps back and look at the confusion people are experiencing and the double-mindedness to know who am I at the core and what's going on externally. It's really painful to observe, and yet I think that John really invited us in a perspective to recognize if you can self-generate that empowering context of really looking inside yourself and saying, who am I and where do I stand and what do I stand for? Even if at times you question that, that's a lot different than orienting yourself from a perspective where you're taking on external information, whether that's information that comes through here and you're looking on your phone or you're hearing on the news, or even in your own home environment. And I think then what it does is we're seeing this from a family system perspective, and whether that's the people that you're living with, even if it's unrelated or not, or your work system, all of those systems, then it becomes this really wobbly object that doesn't have that strength in the foundation at its core. So I think it's a tremendous opportunity to really take a look at that as individuals, as communities, and as a network that's all very interconnected, for good or for bad.
And let me say this, I'm a person who thoroughly enjoys my country. So I'm not an anti-country person at all. But the one thing that I would say really matters to me is I'm a human being first, before you ask me what country I come from. And what that does is put me on equal ground with every other human being. What can often happen is during a time like this, we think more of where we live. We think more of our space in this global community rather than our connectedness. Once we begin thinking about our connectedness, it allows us to be able to deeply appreciate our part of the world, but not discount another part. I had the opportunity of working at a hospital in the Emirates, and the people came from 35 different countries. So one of the things I had to help as I led staff there was the recognition of your place of origin, the country you're coming from is precious. But our common humanity is what we need to hold tightly to, or we can't work together. And we can't appreciate other people. And so, sometimes when I say about in our country, every country has its strengths and its weaknesses. And so I think it really helps when you're able to look at both of those. But it doesn't mean in any way that I'm really not glad to live where I live. But I have to keep in front of me the knowledge that I'm another human being. And I have a lot of other human beings. And to be able to look what other human beings can teach me that I don't see from my part of the space of the world that I live on. That's what's the beauty of, especially at a time like this. And again, something that I don't know people are taking great enough advantage of, is to be able to see this is a pandemic that has hit humanity. So it gives us an opportunity to see how humanity works in other countries as well. And it allows us to see the strengths and weaknesses of those countries so that I can learn something out of both of those. And I think that's the piece that can be very helpful, because sometimes we don't see this pandemic as systemic to the globe. This hit the globe. This didn't hit just one area. And there's not many things that hit like that you're able to take a look and see, how did they handle it? So for instance, in Jordan right now, they've had 9 deaths in the country. There might be something to learn of why that in a country that is very connected and people like to spend a lot of time together, how could you only have 9 deaths? Do they live in their own little pod, each person? No. But what I'm saying is it's part of being open to other people on the planet can teach me something. If you listen today, most people are trying to teach other people what they should do rather than be a learner. This is a learning time. Crisis is a learning time. Whether it's this one or, people are going to deal with crisis the rest of their life. So like if you can get something down through this crisis, it may help you for all the other ones, because I can guarantee every person that they're going to hit more crisis. And especially as they continue to go on in life, there's going to be more. If you get a method down that has really worked for you, you can begin looking that if a crisis comes, I know how to handle that, rather than say at the end of this, and I'm glad I got through that one. Because we may not have another pandemic, but there will be a pandemic in every family. Something that they're going to face that is going to rock the world. And I would say this, most likely rock the world more than this one is. And so learning something through this time, learning a few sort of pieces of life that have helped me, can really set the groundwork for what's ahead. So I just think this is a learning time.
Well, thank you, John. And I think that's a great summary, full circle of where we've been. I think this, as always, would be an invitation for everyone to learn, ourselves included. And I think that orientation to learn first before we go to teach other people is a great perspective to consider holding in our hearts and in our minds as we think about what change could we potentially impact in ourselves and as a community, because there's some tremendous opportunities here. There are things, like John said early on in the hour today, that we're starting to uncover and see that likely were problematic even before this global pandemic hit. And we have a tremendous opportunity to learn from each other, country to country, person to person, tribe to tribe. I think our humanity is that great equalizer. And yet I'd be remiss in saying we're not all on equal playing fields. We're not all weathering the same storm in the same boat. And yet there's a tremendous capacity for us to learn as a global culture and to really change some things coming out of this that will have us healthier and stronger as individuals and as communities. So thank you for joining us, John. Thank you for your time. We will have another community dialogue on health and wholeness next week. So stay tuned. And I would say, as an invitation to the folks who are listening and watching, if there are topics that you'd like for us to cover or experts that are interested in being part of the conversation, please consider yourself invited and have a great day.